The train station sat alone, far from the main roads, as if it had been quietly exiled from the world. It wasn't marked on any current maps, and most of the locals barely acknowledged it existed at all. Those who had lived in the area long enough could remember when it was still in use, a time when passenger trains rattled through almost daily, carrying farmers, traveling salesmen, and wide-eyed families headed for city. That was decades ago. Now, the building sagged under its own weight. The once bright white paint had peeled away in ragged strips, revealing the gray, splintered wood beneath. The roof was warped, with missing shingles that let rain seep in during storms. The platform boards creaked under even the lightest step, and weeds pushed stubbornly through the cracks. On a clear day, the place seemed merely forgotten, a relic of a slower, simpler past. But under moonlight, when shadows stretched long and the wind came whispering through the broken glass of the ticket booth, the station felt different. It felt alive, as though the building itself was listening. For most of the year, the tracks that ran past it stayed quiet. Freight trains thundered along the newer rails miles away, leaving this line unused. The steel was dull with rust, the wooden ties soft with rot. No engineer in their right mind would bring a working locomotive down this route. And yet, sometimes something did. It was never on the timetable. No dispatcher ever knew about it. But those who happened to be near the station after midnight, and who were unlucky or curious enough to linger, told the same story. Through thick fog or in the dead stillness of winter, a train would arrive. Not a modern Amtrak, with sleek cars and bright LED lights, but something older, much older. Its surface was a patchwork of dull, weather-worn metal, yet it reflected the moon in strange ways, as if the light bent differently around it. The headlamp wasn't a bright, clean beam of today's engines, but a golden, almost lantern-like glow that seemed to flicker as it moved. It made no screeching approach, no blast of a horn. Instead, its arrival was heralded by a deep rhythmic sound, like the slow thud of a massive heartbeat. And when it stopped, it did so with an unnatural smoothness, as though it had been gliding on rails made of air. The doors would slide open, though no conductor ever stepped out to greet passengers. And then the people would come. They emerged slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. Some wore the clothes of another century, wool coats, bowler hats, lace-up boots. Others looked like they'd stepped out of recent decades. Flannel shirts from the 70s, windbreakers from the 90s. A few wore clothing so out of place and unfamiliar that no one could guess the era. But no matter what they wore, they all shared the same unsettling features. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the glow from the train windows. Their eyes seemed to catch and hold light in a way that made them look glassy, like marbles. And none of them spoke in anything louder than a whisper. Those who dared to get close enough claimed they could hear it, a single name, repeated over and over by every mouth. The voice of each passenger blended into the others, becoming a low, rippling chant. No one knew why they said it. No one knew what it meant. But the name never changed. Henry Wallace had never been a believer in ghost stories. He was practical, grounded, the sort of man who thought every strange sound in the night had a reasonable explanation: an animal in the attic, a truck downshifting on the highway, the wind working its way through the cracks in an old window frame. But Henry also had a restless curiosity, and when he moved to the countryside that fall, he found himself living less than a mile from the abandoned station. The farmhouse he bought was old, drafty, and cheap, exactly what he could afford after leaving the city. The locals at the diner spoke little to him, but on his third visit, a thin, gray-haired man leaning against the counter told him about the train. Not just a train, the train, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. The man spoke in low tones, as if afraid the story itself might invite something unwelcome. He told Henry about the fog, the strange light, the passengers who whispered a single name. And then, just as quickly, he changed the subject to deer hunting, leaving Henry to wonder if it had been a joke. For days, Henry thought nothing of it, but the image of that station began to pull at him. Each night, after finishing the last chore of the day, he found himself staring out his kitchen window toward the dark silhouette of the tree line where the tracks lay hidden. And then, on the first Saturday in October, he decided to see for himself. He set out near midnight, carrying a flashlight that cut a narrow path through the misty air. The dirt road to the station was barely a road at all, just two parallel ruts swallowed by weeds. Branches clawed at his jacket as he walked, and somewhere far off, an owl called once, then fell silent. When he reached the platform, the place was exactly as he'd imagined. Silent, empty. The ticket booth stood in darkness, the glass clouded by decades of grime. The metal rails were dull and cold under his flashlight beam. He waited 10 minutes, then 20, the only sounds of the whisper wind and the distant gurgle of the river. The next weekend, he returned, and the one after that, nothing. The station remained stubbornly lifeless. But Henry was patient. Then, on a night heavy with fog, it happened. He heard it before he saw it, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't the clatter of wheels on metal. It was slower, deeper, almost organic, like the thump of something massive and alive, pulsing in the dark. The air changed. A chill swept through the platform, the kind of cold that reached bone deep in seconds. Henry's breath rose in pale clouds, curling in the dim light of the moon. Then came the glow. At first, it was a faint smear of gold in the mist, too dim to be an electric headlamp. It swayed slightly as it moved, as if it were not fixed in a machine, but held in a human hand. The sound grew louder, the fog shifting like a curtain as the light neared. And then the train emerged. It looked solid enough. Heavy steel, riveted panels, tall windows glowing with a warm amber light. But the edges shimmered faintly, as if they didn't fully belong to the world around them. The cars rolled to a stop without a single screech of brakes, and the doors slid open in perfect unison. They stepped out. The passengers moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as though their limbs were remembering how to walk. Some were dressed in clothes Henry recognized from history books. Stiff collars, layered skirts, hats that had gone out of style a century ago. Others wore the faded cotton and polyester of more recent decades. But every face was pale, every pair of eyes strange and glassy, catching the light without reflecting it back. And all of them whispered. At first, Henry thought it was just the wind brushing past his ears. But as they drew nearer, he could hear it clearly, one word, over and over, from dozens of voices that somehow blended into one. A name. He didn't recognize it, yet it sent a sharp, electric shiver up his spine, as though some buried part of him did know it. Henry did not sleep that night. When he finally tore himself away from the platform, the fog had swallowed the train, the light, the passengers, everything. One moment it was there, solid and strange. The next it was gone, as if it rolled directly into the mist and dissolved. He walked home in a daze, hardly noticing the crunch of gravel beneath his boots or the aching cold in his hands. The name still echoed in his ears. It was strange, simple, almost ordinary, but the more he tried to recall its exact sound, the more it slipped away, like smoke through fingers. It wasn't that he'd forgotten entirely. It was that some part of him seemed unwilling to say it out loud. Every time he came close, his tongue felt heavy, his mind skipping to another thought. Over the next several days, the memory of the train consumed him. At work, his eyes drifted to the clock, counting down the hours until nightfall. At the grocery store, he found himself staring at strangers, wondering if they too had heard that whisper in the dark. He woke often in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced he had heard the low thrum of wheels in the distance. He began going to the library after work, poring over the town's old records. The place smelled of paper and dust, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Most of the ledgers and photographs were brittle with age, their pages yellowed and fragile. It was on his third visit that he found it. A photograph, dated 1897, showing the station in its prime. The platform was crowded. Men in hats holding suitcases, women in long dresses clutching children's hands. In the foreground stood a young woman, turned slightly toward the camera. Her hair was pinned neatly back, her dress plain but carefully pressed. Her eyes, though grainy in the photograph, seemed to hold a sharpness that made Henry's chest tighten. The caption beneath read, Margaret Lane, photographed shortly before her departure. Disappeared October 17th, 1897. Margaret. The word landed in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples of recognition were immediate and undeniable. That was the name. That was what they had been whispering. Henry sat frozen, staring at the photograph, his fingertips pressed into the paper until he realized he was holding his breath. The archivist at the desk, an older woman with half-moon glasses, noticed his stillness and made her way over. She spoke in a low voice as she told him what she knew. Margaret had been 22 when she boarded the evening train to visit relatives in another state. She had been seen stepping onto the platform, speaking with the conductor, and entering the car. But when the train reached its next stop, Margaret was gone. Her luggage remained in the overhead rack, her ticket still tucked into the seatback. Search parties scoured the countryside, believing she might have fallen from the train or been taken against her will. No body was ever found. No ransom was demanded. It was as if she had simply vanished into the air. Henry turned a page and found more, old newspaper clippings that told of other disappearances. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. One in 1908, another in 1932, then 1955. Always at night, always at the same station, always without witnesses to the exact moment the person vanished. The last recorded case had been in 1984. A man named Raymond Pike, wearing a brown leather jacket, was last seen stepping onto the platform in heavy fog. His car was later found in the station's small parking lot, keys still in the ignition, and in the margins of one particularly faded article, someone had scribbled in pen, "They whisper her name because they're still looking for her." Henry closed the book slowly, but the word stayed with him. Somehow, he knew the opposite was true. They weren't looking for Margaret. They were calling her. By the time December arrived, Henry's life had begun to revolve around the station. He still went to work, still ate his meals, still paid his bills, but those things felt distant, mechanical, as though they belonged to someone else. His real life, the one that made his heart quicken, waited for him in the cold, empty space between the rails. He had stopped telling himself that it was just curiosity. The truth was heavier, more magnetic. The train had become a pull in his mind, like a faint but constant hum that grew louder each night. He could almost feel it under his skin, like a second heartbeat. Snow had started falling that week, the kind that came down in slow, deliberate flakes, muting the world in a soft, cold silence. The old station looked even more forgotten under a thin white shroud, its platform coated in frost that glittered faintly under the moon. The air smelled of iron and damp wood, the kind of scent that belonged to places that hadn't been disturbed in years. Henry waited. The fog came late that night, rolling in low across the tracks, curling around the wooden beams like ghostly fingers. It was thicker than before, swallowing the far end of the platform so completely that Henry could barely see the first few yards of rail. Then he felt it, the shift. It wasn't sound at first, but sensation. The ground under his boots seemed to hum ever so slightly, a tremor so faint he wondered if he had imagined it. Then, from somewhere deep inside the fog, came the rhythm, slow, heavy, steady, the same heartbeat he'd heard in October. The golden glow appeared soon after, bleeding through the mist like the first hint of dawn. It swayed gently as it grew larger, brighter, nearer, until the shape of the engine emerged. The train came to a perfect, soundless stop. The doors slid open in perfect unison, the movement too smooth, too synchronized to belong to anything purely mechanical. The passengers began to step out. They moved with the same unsettling calm, their feet crunching in the snow in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Henry counted at least 24 of them, each dressed in their mismatched clothing from eras scattered across time. A man in a long, woolen coat from the turn of the century stepped down beside a young woman in a neon windbreaker from the 80s. A boy no older than 12 in patched trousers walked past a middle-aged man in what looked like a military uniform from the Second World War. The whispering began almost immediately. It wasn't quiet this time. The sound swelled, a susurrus that seemed to fill the air, wrapping itself around Henry's ears until it was all he could hear. Margaret, over and over, not in unison but layered, as though dozens of voices were speaking from slightly different points in time. Then, through the shifting curtain of fog, Henry saw her. She was stepping down from the nearest car, her movements slow, deliberate. She wore a long, plain dress the color of faded lavender, her hair gathered neatly at the back of her neck. She looked exactly as she had in the photograph from 1897, young, unweathered, untouched by the years. Her skin was pale as the snow, her eyes bright but strange, as though lit from within. She did not glance at the other passengers. She did not join the whispering. She walked forward with purpose, her gaze fixed entirely on him. The crowd seemed to shift around her, forming a loose path in the snow. The whispering swelled, the air around Henry growing colder with each of her steps. He could feel the frost settling in his lungs as he breathed. When she stopped only a few feet away, the whispers fell into a strange, unnatural rhythm, as if they were all breathing through one set of lungs. Every face turned toward Henry, and deep in his mind, beneath fear, beneath reason, something stirred. A memory, blurred and ancient, a vision of standing on the same platform, but in a different time, of hearing the whistle of a train that no longer ran, of seeing this woman before him, and of making a promise he could no longer recall. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Snowflakes drifted slowly between them, settling on Margaret's hair, clinging to the fabric of her dress. She stood perfectly still, the fog curling at her ankles, her gaze fixed on Henry with an intensity that pinned him in place. She raised one pale hand. It wasn't a gesture of greeting or warning. It was an invitation, simple and wordless. The movement was so small, yet it filled Henry with an almost physical pull. His body leaned forward before his mind could decide. One step. The frost under his boot crunched, and the whispering passengers leaned ever so slightly toward him, their heads tilting in unison, like flowers seeking the same patch of sunlight. The air was no longer just cold. It was heavy, thick, pressing in on all sides. 2 steps. The edges of the platform blurred. The snow, the trees, even the moonlight seemed to dim, as though a veil had been drawn over the world. The deep, rhythmic thump of the train's heartbeat grew louder, syncing perfectly with the pulse in his ears. 3 steps, and he was standing beside her. Margaret lowered her hand and turned toward the open door of the nearest car. Without speaking, she began to walk, her dress brushing softly against the snow. Henry followed, the distance between them closing in a way that felt both instant and infinite. The threshold of the train was colder than the air outside. Crossing was like stepping into a place where seasons, time, and distance had no meaning. The dim amber glow inside the car revealed rows of passengers seated in perfect stillness, their faces pale, their eyes catching the light but never reflecting it back. Henry realized, with a strange lack of surprise, that some of those faces looked familiar, not because he knew them personally, but because he had seen them in the photographs and newspaper clippings at the library. Margaret's missing contemporaries. The soldier from 1943, the young boy from 1908, the man in the leather jacket from 1984, all sitting in silence, their lips moving faintly in the same rhythm as the whispering outside. The door slid shut behind him without a sound. Through the fog window, the station was already beginning to recede. The platform, the weeds, the broken glass of the ticket booth, all slipping backward into the mist. The train moved without a jolt, without the sound of gears or grinding metal, only the steady, inhuman heartbeat beneath his feet. Henry sat down. The seat was strangely warm, as though someone had been waiting for him. Around him, the passengers kept whispering Margaret, their voices a constant tide of sound that filled the space without ever growing louder. He turned his head toward her, but she was no longer standing. She was seated at the front of the car, hands folded in her lap, staring forward with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel. She was not one of the passengers. She was guiding them. Outside the windows, the world no longer looked like the countryside. There were no trees, no snow, only a shifting darkness threaded with faint, pale lights that moved like deep-sea creatures in an unseen ocean. The train glided forward, and Henry knew, without being told, that there would be no stops. No one ever came back. At the old station, the fog thinned just before dawn. By the time the first morning birds stirred in the trees, there was nothing left to suggest a train had been there at all. No tracks in the snow, no footprints, only the quiet sigh of the wind across the platform. In town, no one would notice Henry's absence right away. It would take days before a neighbor wondered why the lights in his farmhouse stayed off at night, and longer still before anyone mentioned his name in the same breath as the station's. And when they did, they would lower their voices, glancing toward the tracks as if afraid something might hear them. Far away, somewhere between worlds, the train that wasn't on the schedule rolled on, its heartbeat steady, its windows glowing faintly in the eternal dark. Inside, the passengers whispered on and on, their voices carrying the same name